Welcome to the third episode of the Fifth Discipline Book Club. We've got Dave Eva, Eric Willicke, and myself, Mark Richards, on the call. And our goal today is to make it through more than one chapter. But I suspect that we're going to struggle with that because we finally actually are on the beer game chapter. And I know I've been very excited about it, although Eric suspects it's just because I love beer so much. So, welcome, guys. We are on the air, the beer game. So I thought just on the off chance people are reading this, following us and have no idea what we're talking about with the beer game and are thinking about beer pong. A quick context setter, game developed by MIT in the 1950s to illustrate how difficult it is to manage dynamic systems. In this case, it's a supply chain delivering beer from a brewery to the end consumer. And a lot of colleges use it as a mandatory exercise in their business management or MBA courses still. And chapter 3 is all about the beer game. The title of the chapter is Prisoners of the System or Prisoners of Our Own Thinking. So I know my world of the beer game right now is actually very caught up in preparing to facilitate it for the first time. But before I start talking about things I've learnt about the mechanics of the beer game, I thought I might throw to Eric and Dave. Dave, I know you love a good beer because you've introduced me to many a good beer in London. High level thoughts on the beer game from you?
Well, I'd love to play it. I'm very envious that you have the opportunity to play it with some of your clients. Maybe we should get a little. Once you've learned how to facilitate it, we should do a little session amongst ourselves, shouldn't we? We should
Absolutely.
have a go because I love experiential learning. In addition to this, I mean, I've obviously read quite a lot of, and I put the stats there because the metrics I think are fascinating to see how out of whack the whole system gets. I mean, it is quite considerably. The distributor has a serious problem on that. As you can see, I mean, they are in some serious trouble. But I loved a little quote. In addition to this book, I've been reading the Field Guide, which is the field book with the fifth discipline field book.
Yep.
And there's a little quote in there about the beer game coming out of a laboratory from the Sloan School of Management, and they say that a scenario exercise has been successful when you feel a premonition that shakes your worldview. And I think some of Senge's experiences of playing this whip beer game are where he sees people where they literally go, "Oh my God, I cannot believe that I'm making really bad choices about firing personnel based on the fact that it has nothing to do with them." And I think it's so good. These experiential games are so powerful. I just cannot get enough of experiential learning. So I'm looking forward to this chapter.
Um, yeah, it's actually one of the things I was reflecting on as I did my kind of reminder of the notes I wrote weeks ago before today. And it's interesting, you go back and you relook at stuff. And one of the things that really stood out to me is how powerfully, all the way through the book, Senge takes really simple, relatable examples to explain really complex things. And whether it's the beer game for understanding dynamic systems and long supply chain effects, or illustrations of taps to talk us through systems diagrams or boiled frog metaphors. He so easily goes, let me use something that you can instantly relate to for some really complex thing, which I think is the power of gamification, right? When you make something real for people. Eric, high level beer game insights before we dig deep.
Yeah, so I'll plus one Dave on the experiential gaming piece. That has been a hallmark of good workshops and experiences for me indefinitely, and don't want to lose that. That's a heck of a lot of fun and just great learning when it happens. This one specifically just brings so many of the lessons that I wish leaders would find more easily right in their face. So I can't wait to hear the debrief you have of it in a couple weeks after you get a chance to run it with clients, because well, I forget if I've ever experienced it. I think I did the red bead. I didn't get to do this one. And um, just watching people see the concepts is so delightful. And I've got a ton of quotes and stuff that hit me in this section, but I think the one that just to highlight as we go in is the way it's presented in the book. I really actually enjoyed the story that goes along with it.
Yep.
Too often it's presented as here's the exercise and here's what we learned, but to hear it from the points of view of the three different key roles in the system brings it to life in a way that a lot of exercises don't for me. Um, I get the lesson, but I don't get the story feel.
It's that notion of taking stories written from multiple perspectives and then seeing what happens is really
A lot of my
powerful.
a lot of my favorite fiction follows that format. So of course, my business fiction or business writing probably has the same preferences. Mark, do you want to pull Wolfgang in and let him do a cold start?
Thank you for noticing that Wolfgang was here. Let me pull him in. Welcome, Wolfgang. You are in the stream room with no camera as it stands.
Hi.
Bill Commons.
Can you hear me?
We can.
And we will cue you up into a cold start of what were your perspectives on the beer game in 60-second format.
But we will let you warm up to that cold start because I was about to pick up on the thread that Eric had just mentioned. Once I get our names in the correct sequence. Where are we? That's more like it. That notion of the kind of seeing through different lenses of the way that he tells the story was actually a really interesting flashback for me on the gamification front to the most complex gamification exercise I've ever been part of, which was when I went on the problem solving leadership course with Jerry Weinberg and Esther Darby. And they have a day at that where literally the morning is setting up for the simulation. From midday through close to 6 p.m. is playing the simulation. And the whole of the next day is debriefing the simulation. And the most incredible simulation I've ever been part of. But one of the things they do in the setup is they have an observer team. So there's a lot of focus in that course on actually the role of the observer and observation. And they've taken us through all this stuff about, different things you might observe. And I decided that observation would be really, really interesting rather than being part of the game. Because I was interested in flexing some of the new things they'd taught us to observe. So we had this little observation team of like 3 people. And we had a pre-planning session to go, who's going to pay attention to what? And there were kind of main characters in the simulation. So there's a little bit of who's following the story of which character. There were also different things you might pay attention to in terms of, the intensity of conversation or the way people are moving around the room. And so the 3 of us basically spent 5 hours taking notes through the lens of observation we'd picked to take. And then we had a job that night to assemble our observations to play them back the next morning as the kickstart to the morning and the day's debriefing. And we got together after dinner. So it was like 8 o'clock when we started compiling our observations. And it was 2 a.m. when we finished assembling the story. And it was because we just kept having these moments where 2 of us would play something back on the same timeline and be like, at this moment, this was happening over here. And somebody else would be like, oh, that explains this that was happening over here. And it simulates running a company like a startup company. And the first piece of the simulation is a vote for who's going to be CEO. And the vote mechanics broke because being a bunch of lean agile people, the hour time box they had for voting in the CEO, they spent 58 minutes deciding on the protocols for fairly voting on the CEO and wound up leaving the room with a very primitive last minute rush vote because Jerry said, I'm kicking you out and picking the CEO for you if you haven't got a call made on the 60-minute mark. And what wound up happening was the CEO who lost in the game wound up forming a breakaway company because he got very frustrated with the way that the voted in CEO was running the company. And this thing that happened as we took the different lenses we'd seen on the system at work and started to compile them together, how much of the story we'd seen that none of us, although, notionally, 5 hours of just observing and taking notes. Because of our different focuses, we hadn't seen the whole picture. And that was, man, obviously it's a vivid memory because I love gamification so much. And it was such a powerful learning experience. But that thread of the telling the different stories and then seeing the way they come together in the chapter, really strong. So,
But
sorry, go on.
at risk of tangenting us, but I'll say that so we don't. Your story just reminds me so much of being back at Rally and the group room full of coaches and the we'll call it an honor to be elected facilitator of that group. Usually we either had the most experienced or the newest coach, depending on how upset we were at the moment. But facilitating a bunch of coaches is one of the hardest jobs in the world, in my experience. But I'll just leave that at that.
Yeah, that's a very high risk tangent. Completely agree, though. Wolfgang, we are at high level thoughts on the big game chapter before we dive into hard detail. Now that you've kind of warmed up and got your brain moving, your high level thoughts?
Hmm. So, I mean, obviously, like when in the end the outcome is that um, the people didn't really order more beer. It was just like the ripple effects in the in the systems that made all the like the things the emotional things happening to the people who have been part of the different systems. So this is of course or at least it was for me a very strong it has a very strong effect on me. It's like, okay, is that actually really happening in other things too? And then of course I started thinking about other things in my life or in my work life where I had similar experiences with that, and was that due to the same reasons that like the beer game showed. For me, this is a thinking process that is constantly there since I read that chapter again. Like I read that book years ago, then I didn't really think about that anymore. But now that I read it again a couple of weeks ago, this is something that changed my perspective right now on like how I perceive the world. It's like a second layer of uh, perceiving what is going on around me and whether there is such an effect happening right now. So um, I would say I'm still in the process of trying to comprehend the full depth of that chapter, even though it's like intellectually it's absolutely clear for me, but it's not something that I can fathom yet. It has so much depth. I think that it will probably take me a while to incorporate that perspective completely into my everyday life.
I just want to take a moment. I've just realised we've got a comment from a visitor. Well, I've got a comment from a bot there. Auto scroll is my help. We had somebody on the line. It's Martin saying hi. Hope you're doing well. And I just want to say thank you. You are our second non-community member to be watching on chat and interacting with us. And I'll keep an eye on chat in case you come back with more comments. So I'm going to just dig a little bit into, because of course, as I'm prepping to facilitate this thing, I had the job this week of learning enough about facilitating it to set time boxes in agendas. And what I found was there are 1,000,001 online simulations. There are some very expensive online simulations. And I was looking for the best kind of online expense, which was free. So the best online one I could find in my first round of thinking was from Transentis. So I've dropped that on the mirror. I'll put a link in when we get it across to YouTube. They have an online simulation that looks great. Plays up to 16 groups. But of course, I wanted to play in person rather than online, because I think the trade-off that came out was logistically way easier online, and a lot of the universities are doing it through computers for the ease of logistics. But learning is always deeper in person, physically than online. And so I found a reference paper on ResearchGate that was from a university who runs it as a standard thing in their business programs once a year, and they did a massive write-up on how to set it up, main logistics involved in facilitation, and I've dropped the PDF there and a URL, and again, I'll pop the URLs on YouTube. Incidentally, on the way through, it was a very risky website because I found it, and the whole website was paper after paper on complex system simulations, which could have been a rabbit hole I didn't come out of from a long time. But they had some interesting comments on the way they had feedback from students and the way they'd iterated it. They also talked a lot about the power of doing it in person rather than through computers, and they'd gone through the trade-offs, and they were down to how much does it cost us in terms of materials and all the rest of it. And their comment was that although it would have been much easier to run it on computers, their experience was that in-person play was immensely more powerful. So I also found the MIT PowerPoint deck. In actual fact, you can buy copies of, they've made game boards almost get Kanban style. And you can buy materials from it from MIT. But they also have the slides for the briefing and the debriefing up online. So I chuck them on the Miro as well. And again, I'll stick them in the YouTube. What I found from a timing perspective, it feels like it's kind of 15 to 30 minutes of pre-brief and setup. As you'd expect, it is one facilitation assistant per 4 to 5 groups playing it. And they varied between playing in groups of 4, like one per role, or in 8 with a pair per role. And generally what I figured out in terms of the actual mechanics of it is probably printing a A0 poster with a game board on it, so that you can kind of manage the upstream, downstream logistics of order processing week by week and sort of visualize the flow by moving pieces on the game map. 2 hours physical playtime was kind of standard recommendation everywhere, which included time for them to do their summary write-up and make their graphs. Because, of course, the debrief leverages the graphs, much like a Get Kanban debrief leverages the CFDs. It felt like the kind of thing you could debrief for 3 hours easily. But everything that I read through in terms of debriefing it felt like 60 minutes was kind of the do it justice, bare minimum. So things I found prepping to facilitate. Now, moving a bit deeper into it, I notice a couple of quotes here. I see your laboratory quote, Dave, that you dropped in earlier, and your premonition that shakes your worldview. I saw it when you dropped that in the other night, and I couldn't see who it was, and I went, why did I not highlight the shake your worldview thing, given my passion for developing experiential learning? Somebody else has dropped the note that they loved it too. Who was that one? The purple post-it.
Purple's me.
There you go. We have talked about the graphs that you had, Dave. So let's drop straight into lessons of the beer game. So obviously the most powerful learning that stood out when I read the debrief was the simple structure influences behavior. And that quote around, when placed in the same system, people, however different, tend to produce similar results. And we've got to look into the underlying structures which shape individual actions and create the conditions where types of events become likely. And it's one of the trade-offs that was running through my head as I was thinking about facilitating, because I've got a first experiment with a small leadership group, and then I've got a second experiment 2 days later with a big group. And I'm going to be curious to see whether we can get that depth of learning when it's only a couple of teams playing versus when it's a lot of teams playing. But the trigger on structure influences behavior actually set me off thinking about that, how he brings things to life, because, you go straight to the Deming quote, or the Deming quotes around a bad system will beat a good person every time. And, 94% of your problems belong to the system of work and 6% to the worker. I've always remembered the 95 and the 5, but when I went digging for the quote, I went, I've been misquoting for the last 10 years. And, I can't tell you how many times I've stood at the front of the room and misquoted the 95%, the 5% of the system of work and the worker. And people go, yeah, whatever. But I looked at the beer game and I went, what a powerful way of just bringing that to life in terms of going, we're going to place you in a system of work. And then in the debrief, you're going to recognize that, this same set of behaviors just came out for everybody because of the system of work we placed you in and what that could do in terms of triggering discussion about politics and people's behavior in the workplace. What we got? Got a quote in here. People in the business world love heroes. Who was that? Do you want to tell us a little bit more?
Yeah, that was me. Is a bad system? It promotes certain people to become heroic in trying to fix the system, and if they're then rewarded for being the hero, then they're not going to fix the underlying causes of why the system's broken in the first place. And it's the typical thing. Well, I think many of us would have seen it in many transformations, but it's the Brent character in the Phoenix Project book. It's like if you don't fix that the problem of why everyone goes to that one person to be the hero again, then you're never going to make the system better for everyone in the system. So that's why I put that there. As I think it's if we keep resorting to heroics, we'll never make the system work for everyone. It's going to stop us from really improving anything.
Nice. What else we got here? The quote about the villains or the culprits. Is that you, Eric?
Yes. Sorry, I was looking at my highlighted area. This is just, it kind of goes along with Norm Kurth's retrospective prime directive. And I just really love this mindset of acknowledging that everybody was actually doing the best they could with what they knew, but they didn't know everything. And nor will we ever know everything in the real world environments. And it's the different angle, maybe it's the more humanized version of the 94 versus 6% thing, is people are trying really hard. They're doing good work. They're not lazy. They're not slacking off. They're not ignoring signals. These are good people trying really hard, and still the system is behaving this way.
Yep.
And that to me is one of the biggest takeaways for a manager, putting my people leader hat back on, is I have to look at the system as my go-to habit when something goes wrong. I can't look at the person as my go-to habit either on the heroism or the negative side.
Yeah, that was a trigger for me as well. And in actual fact, it's changed a couple of the conversations that I've had literally over the last week in a coaching context. Because so often I find, coaching calls with leaders come back to the politics and the corridor violence. And I'm regularly in that world where it's, so let's have a think about what's motivating the actions of whoever it is that's the topic of the moment, to try and step back and take the personal out of it to understand more of the situation. And it's interesting. I've found just literally having this stuff fresh in my head has been really useful in terms of the way that I structure a moment to go through this person's just killing me into finding a path through. Because I'm assuming you're in the same place as me, Eric. There are many a time where I get a call from an executive I'm coaching on their drive home, or as they're unwinding from the day, and they're just like, Mark, I need a safe place to vent. Just let me unload a head of steam on you.
I consider it a good day when they are able to wait until their drive home.
It also, that actually, just listening to you talk about that quote, it triggered a back thought for me that happened during the week. When we were talking about the boiled frog last week, and the thing that had really stood out to me in his treatment of the boiled frog was the cognitive impairment that arose as the temperature arose. So when it got to the point where it was starting to be threatening and finally recognizable that the heat had made it drowsy and it couldn't see it, And I started to parallel that back mentally this week to the fact that when there's chaos, pressure, and crisis in a workplace, that the level of noise that is coming at people in that moment actually in itself is a cognitive impairment. That kind of recognition of the pattern of events where people are suddenly so busy getting dragged between, requests for information coming in while they're in a meeting talking about information, um, and the overload that can happen there in terms of your ability to step back and be rational is actually a really interesting parallel to the bald frog. Another one of your quotes, I'm guessing, Eric? Laws of history, I figure it's got to be an Eric.
How clear you are. I've started noticing for the screenshots we use different fonts in Kindle, so that's going to become a tell as we get more used to each other, I think, collectively. But in this case, this one was a big one for me, and it was just the excerpt from, is this Tolstoy? I forget. But a lot of my historical coaching has been focused on leadership and leadership actions. And yet, I've always been a huge fan of empathy interviews and collecting the data and the perspective of many. Reading this quote from a good long while ago, like I think it was over 100 years ago, it was written, just really hit me like, oh, yes, it's easy to look at the leaders. It's easy to look at the heroes and decide they were the ones that had the causal effect. And I see it flipped around and saying, no, they are the result of the causal effect of the system's influence on the many. Honestly, started to I can feel some shifts starting in how I actually think about transformation at scale as a result of that.
Yeah.
Like it's not going to be a black and white big thing, but it's like, oh, there's some nuance in there that is going to change my worldview a little bit.
Yep. All right. So that's all our highlights on the primary lessons around structure influences behavior. Structure is subtle and leverage often comes from new ways of thinking.
Did we want to talk a little bit about the graphs that I think Dave dropped in there?
Why don't we go back to them? Dave, you mentioned you dropped them in because it told a startling story. Do you want to elaborate a little bit more and take yourself off mute or master the fact that Discord has push to talk, which is much more elegant?
There we go. I've taken myself off mute. Yes. Yeah. You wouldn't think I've been using this for a couple of years, would you? There we go. Anyway, what I thought was amazing by looking at the graphs, and I'm sure the people that watch this won't be able to see the graphs, sadly, but
Yes,
a
they're
small.
looking at the graphs right now.
Oh, are you? Oh, okay, cool. Well, a small disturbance at the retailer level just has these massive washes of greater effect up through the system. And the retailers were never really that out of whack, but the over-ordering by them just caused this massive tidal wave of disruption through the whole system. And you could see that the poor old distributor just caught the rough end of everything going. I mean, they were so far over inventory, it was unreal. But I think that just tells a really nice, that I think metrics and graphs just tell beautiful trends. And it's just such a nice way of looking at how badly affected the whole system was by a little tiny bump right at the start. It's amazing.
Yeah. All right. Moving down.
And that,
Sorry, Eric?
well, so there's a question that keeps coming up with kind of all games, all simulation-based games, is if somebody already knows the rules, how badly does it break the game? And it, like some games I've watched people that have been in classes or events like 5 or 6 times over, and they're like, oh, I've seen this ballpoint game. We're going to start here this time. And the role of experience changes it, but they don't quite win it because there's no like perfect way. But in this system, it is a knowable system. If you know what the disruption is going to be, and you, frankly, if you know it's actually only one change right at the beginning and then nothing else changes in the system, and everything else is people's reactions, does it break the simulation or what happens to it?
So I suspect there's a little bit there which is going to be what role you're in terms of prior knowledge. I will actually get a chance to see how that plays out because although I have nobody who's played the game before, I have somebody who's read about it and who I know will have reread about it by the time we're playing it. So I'll see what happens. I think quite often it's amazing how the heat and excitement of the moment overrides all common sense. And
then
well, it that probably gets you. And I know I've got a whole bunch of quotes that I've been taking on cognitive bias that were triggered for me a couple of chapters down the path. But I think there's a world where the emotion takes over the intellect, and gamification does a really good job of creating that. But you did just trigger a very funny memory for me, which was way, way back when back in the Telstra days, first safe implementation over 10 years ago, we played Get Kanban with the leadership team. And we had M on the same table as her RTE. And of course, everybody was very competitive. And M was there going, I'm going to use everything I know about lean to win this game. Right? Of course, we're going to lower whip. Of course, we're going to do this. Of course, we're going to do that. And Wayne, her RTE, was like, no, we're here to learn, not to win. So every time she made a suggestion based on what Lean would say, Wayne would just deliberately say the opposite. the poor team playing with them went up incredibly confused because they've got M saying one thing and Wayne saying the other. And he was like, I maximise their learning.
it's interesting when people in the same system are playing for different goals.
Yes.
Because what came to mind as I was asking that question, I'm assuming you've all seen the people playing basketball and you're supposed to watch, and then the gorilla walks through the back of the scene and nobody notices. But the one that got me and really had me appreciative was the follow-up video to that, where you're so busy knowing the game and watching for the gorilla that you don't notice that the curtain color changes, that the players swap out, that all this other stuff changes because you're so fixated looking for the one thing that you know is going to be there. That sure enough, the gorilla goes across, or the man in the ape suit or whatever, but everything else changed. And they're like, yeah, so you were expecting to see this. But did you notice this? And it's like, oh God, they got me.
In actual fact, I had a gorilla quote that nearly made it onto this Miro. Because there's a dissection of the gorilla event in Thinking Fast and Slow. And part of what happened for me this week was starting to think about cognitive bias being part of the system of work. And what happens if you go another layer in terms of the way the system programs things to start to think about cognitive bias. But yeah, that's chapter 5.
I think in the field book they do mention the fact that some people have seen the sim before they go in, and then they pick a strategy and they go in and they stick to it, and then they don't learn anything because they've made up their minds before they go in. So I think that's one of the funny things that happens as well. Yeah.
All right, let's move on. Learning disabilities. And I mean, obviously the quotes here, I assume this is you, Eric, that dropped this in. It was a beautiful moment where you realise that actually every single learning disability from the previous chapter turns up in the game, which I look forward to priming in my debrief in terms of designing the questions that are going to bring these out.
Mm-hmm. And it was just for me, it was interesting because a week or two ago, we talked about how to use those disabilities.
Yeah.
And whether they should be diagnostic, whether they should be this, that, or the other thing, and just bringing that forward and thinking, oh, debrief questions, use them as illustrative examples in the context of the conversation around something else. Doesn't bring them into a sense of blame, it just brings it into a sense of observation. And that I found kind of powerful.
Yeah. Raising awareness, which I suspect might have been the situation with the guy who ran out of the room to stop the firing process. You can easily see that happening in the debrief of the beer game. Anybody else? Anything they wanted to add on the learning disability call out? All right. I did just want to spend a couple of minutes on his model around levels of explanation. So that notion of the layers at which you can observe something, as in, are you seeing the systemic structure or the patterns of behavior or the events, and the potential insights that come. And I think what struck me when I looked at that 3 layers was maybe an awareness that I have often confused patterns of behavior with systemic structure. because I'm very natively wired to go events to patterns. And if we go back to our first chat about this book and me going, I have become lazy and I intuit things rather than deliberately modeling them to see them. What happened as I reflected on this was to go, actually what I do is I intuit and I find patterns, and I stop there. And it was a real trigger for me to go, okay, patterns is only one layer deep, and systemic structure is the next layer to tap. I don't know, did this model stand out to anybody else? I see, Eric, you're dragging a quote around.
It did. But it was really more of a thought I had just now as you shared, was thinking of it in terms of where we jump to is interesting, because I do the same thing where it's like, okay, I pattern match as a matter of instinct almost. But I realized I also talk quickly about what the implications are for systemic structure without showing people the path from reactive to responsive and then getting to the generative. And I'm wondering, I want to reflect on this after the call a little more, but my initial self-awareness question is going to be, is that limiting people's ability to follow my thinking and therefore limiting my effectiveness if I don't show my path as instinctively as I think the path?
That's an interesting prompt, isn't it?
Yeah, remind me that I had that prompt and I'll tell you what I learned.
I will hold you to that. Wolfgang or Dave, any comments on the levels of exploration? Things that triggered for you?
So yes, you. I'm I'm listening so hard to what you say, so that I have to switch first before I can say something. Now, so for me, that makes a lot of sense. So like, where do I usually, like, when I'm in a consulting engagement, when I'm talking to the people, what do I usually see when I'm talking with people about things that happen? So it's of course sometimes it's just the reactive thing, saying, okay, who did what to whom? Okay, this is a given. It's just like the fastest response that you get, like what actually happened. But saying, okay, the responsive part, it is something that usually a lot of people that I encounter strive to go there. The structural thing is actually not that common, which like for me, it's how should I say, like it's the thing that I'm striving for, and I'm really thankful that there is a name for that in the book, because actually it was more a feeling than something that I could really articulate. Now there is something like a word for it, saying, hey, there is something deeper. It's not just that you're odd or that you are trying to do something different. It's actually something that makes sense in the larger picture. And maybe it's just me, but for me, when I'm trying to, in a coaching situation, go down to this systematic structure, it's sometimes not that well received. Probably it's me, like not doing a good enough job. But when I thought about it, it's like I had a lot of occasions where I had the feeling that it's not only not the first thing that people go to, but sometimes it's a thing that people actually don't want to go into. Like they reject that to a degree. Not everyone, of course, and not in every situation. But this was what came to my mind. Like, why is that actually? I don't have an answer for that. It's like, why is this systematic structure, this generative view, why is that not the most common thing in, like, usually when you're working with people in larger companies, they are pretty smart. It's not that they are lacking the intellectual capacity of doing that or whatever. It's more like, do they really want to go there? And now I'm struggling with that, to be honest, because it's like going there. Is that the right thing to do? Because most of the time, when I get this feeling of rejection, I don't go there, and I'm leaving that where it is, and I'm trying something else. Now, reading
So,
that, I thought, is it the right thing to do? Should I persist on that?
Eric, you had a thought?
just in response to that, I mean, that is actually the thinking process that led to the quote I put on the board after, is really a question of why are people so against wanting to engage at that level? And he really nails it it's the penultimate paragraph in this chapter. Deepest insight usually comes when people they realize that their problems and their hopes for improvement are inextricably tied to how they think. And this is the sentence that really got me. Generative learning cannot be sustained in an organization where event thinking predominates. And I think that, Wolfgang, is really underlying the entire tension you're describing here. Is if you're not used to this, it is threatening, it's challenging, it's foreign, it's alien, and everything around it just doesn't make sense. Especially going back to the 3 steps that Mark had up a few minutes ago, if you can't connect that through a set of patterns of behavior, hence my point, if I don't bring people along through seeing these patterns, that jump from events to generative is even worse, even more painful. It's like you're speaking a foreign language because you kind of are at that point.
I think something that's kind of triggered for me as I've listened to both of you is, that you can actually quite deliberately use patterns as a path to systemic. Because if you can see a pattern, right, you can't systemic model everything because it's time consuming to think your way through systemic modeling everything. But you can build a habit that says, can we see a pattern? Can I help somebody see a pattern? And then if we can see the pattern, we can then ask the question and say, what drives the pattern, right? There's a pattern here. That's interesting. Why don't we go down one more layer? So you're actually starting to use it as a journeying tool rather than trying to get people to take one huge step to go, well, let's find the pattern because that's one step. It's not a giant leap. And then having seen the pattern to go, what happens if we peel that back one more layer? So you can actually think about it as a journeying tool.
Though I had this week, I had a call where it, it felt strange, to be honest. At first, like it was a situation, of course, as always with solution trains and large solutions and things. And then we talked about team structure, and there were a lot of teams mapped on a whiteboard, and so we went through the team structure, saying, "Hey, how many people are in these teams?" And then it turned out that most of the teams actually had much more people in the teams than what a usual Scrum team or a normal Agile team should have, like 20, 30 people or whatever. And then I like tried to dig deeper. Why is that? And why is there not any other patterns to apply for this larger body of people? Why the team structure? And so this is, I think, like afterwards, I thought about, okay, what is motivating this behavior? And there are structures that we have in the HR world, like when you go to save, you have this art construct and the teams and things. And so the people are so, I would say, hypnotized by these constructs that they are not seeing other structures. They try to match everything to the structures that are given. And this is something that probably it's more prevalent than what I was aware of. And through reading that again and thinking deeper about it, I got a different perspective. But I think this generative approach is something that you really have to have a certain amount of freedom in your mind or in your, like, how you see the world, how you perceive everything around you, because otherwise you will just be stuck in a certain set of structures that is given to you by the company, by a framework, or by whatever. and you will always try to get to match that to these structures that you have in mind, because they are like socially aligned, or these are the structures that people know about, and so it's better to stay in these structures. I think there is a lot of education necessary to get people out of this, like out of this box thinking, like, okay, these are the structures that we have, and we try to justify whatever we have in within the structures that are given.
All right. Now, in keeping with our goal of making it through more than one chapter today, I'm going to transition us, but I'm going to
Thank you.
give Dave the closing word on the beer game before we open the next chapter. Dave, what's your closing word on the beer game?
Closing word on the beer game. Look, my closing word on the beer game is I want to play the beer game, and I'd like to experience it, because I haven't experienced it. It looks phenomenal. I'm very interested in how it goes with your executives, if you're allowed to tell us how it goes, because I think the proof of the pudding is in the eating with experiential games, right? And I'm
Yeah.
sure it's going to be powerful.
All right. Let's talk about chapter 4. I don't know if we'll make it to the close of chapter 4. We'll see how we go. It's maybe less exciting than the beer game. But chapter 4, the laws of the fifth discipline. And this is, of course, the 11 laws. I had a couple of favorites. But again, probably let's start with the kind of highlights of the 11 laws before we delve into any specific law. Anybody have a highlight for them of the 11 laws of the chapter before we're in specifics? Floor is open.
Mine's like one sentence. I am stunned how many of these I can very quickly come up with stories that match to each of these.
Yeah. While the other guys think, I will share mine, which is you can have your cake and eat it too, is a buzz phrase that I have used quite regularly over the last 2 weeks. I found it a really powerful metaphor for triggering a conversation, right? Just grabbing somebody in and then triggering a good follow on with it. So I love the simplicity of the way that he expressed the laws, such as you can have your cake and eat it too, as a hook to a conversation, rather than starting with something that feels deep and abstract. Wolfgang or Dave, highlights of chapter 4?
Dave, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I like Eric. I mean, you read these, and they're all still. I mean, they're all you can recognize them in almost all of the work you do. So I mean, yeah, I didn't have the revelation you had about the cake and eating it 2-bit, but I mean, yeah, it's just you can remember the old pain of many situations reflected through all of these things. Yeah, absolutely.
But I love especially the 10th, dividing an elephant in half does not produce two small elephants. I mean, it makes sense, obviously, but it like when you read through that part of the book, there were a lot of things coming up saying, okay, am I also like a victim to this kind of thinking? And the same is true for the second one. The harder you push, the harder the system pushes back. Of course, this is a given, but it's also something that I thought a lot about. Is that something that I'm doing, or where do I do it, and how can I change my behavior on that? So these are really resonating with me. I mean, the others as well, but 2 and 10 resonated the most, I think.
I think
Well,
5 also was very interesting, because the one where you've highlighted, in business we can shift the burden to consultants or other helpers, and it's like that's like, hello, that's our people like us, right? I mean, are we part of the problem? And maybe sometimes we are. I don't know.
yeah, 5 was a big standout for me. But let's take 2. Let's zoom in on 2. So the harder you push, the harder the system pushes back. That one hit me. Actually, hit me pretty hard as I thought about it. And I really loved the way he used the Animal Farm metaphor actually throughout this chapter. So the reference to Boxer, I think Boxer was the horse in Animal Farm, and the way he'd use the Animal Farms to bring things, the characters to bring things to life. But this whole notion, if only we work harder, we'll find a way through. We'll just keep pushing and we'll get past the pain. you can so easily recognize that. And I actually think the kind of meta level question that it raises for me, or it raised for me, was, and this was probably a provocation that started to turn up as you get deeper into the next chapters. I have so oriented my coaching credo to, in XP terms, turn up the good, or in switch terms, focus on the bright spots, right? Find stuff that's working and amplify it, or draw attention to it to inspire more. There's been an awful lot of that in my general coaching life. And you could also play it in terms of the failure demand versus value demand metaphor. And I read this and I went, I wonder if I am guilty of overbalancing in terms of over focusing on the turn up the good, as opposed to recognizing that, in trying to turn up the good, sometimes maybe you're just pushing harder. I saw an interesting expression on your face, Eric. You're about to school me, aren't you?
No, you just may have shattered some things in my brain here. And the real question, because I was literally just writing this morning about bright spots in a couple sections of my program and the role of leaders in amplifying those. And I'm sitting here looking at law number 8 at the same time, or we can pull in theory of constraints or pick your favorite point of impact thing. And I use the theory of constraints language because it's more fresh for me, is if we are serving at the bottleneck, amplify the bright spots. But if you're not at the bottleneck, if you're not at the point in the system where changes can have outsized results, you're right. You might be doing harm with that. And I hadn't really thought about it that way. And I like more self-reflection.
I feel relieved now. I watched your face and I went, "Oh my God, Eric's about to go." Mark, why didn't you figure that 5 years ago? Because it was quite
Mark, you're a
confronting for
complete
me.
idiot because you didn't tell me about this 5 years ago and I needed it then.
All right, so moving away from me being a complete idiot, a couple of quotes dropped in from the side. Many companies experience. I'm going to recognize your font sooner or later, Eric. Is this you? Or was it Dave? No, Dave has a very different font.
I don't use serifs in my fonts.
Oddly, I have different fonts on my Windows view than I do in my Kindle, so that gets even more interesting. And I resized the screen so I didn't recognize it as mine. This one was more just because it was in that section, but it's so common. And I like this because it's not a localized example. I think a lot of the examples are too easily applied to like individual people.
Yep.
But in this case, the example is complete system company level. Like, of course we're being commoditized, so of course we need to market more, and of course, and of course, and of course. And as I read Zone to Win and other things, it's like, or you could take this entire other way out. But you get further and further down that trap, and like I've lived experience in a couple different companies where once you're in the cycle, it's hard enough to see your way out, much less act your way out. Like even if you say, yeah, we should, everybody agrees, yes, we should, and then keeps on doing what they said in the past. So this one just really hit me as 3 or 4 different examples of companies that have been trapped in this cycle.
And then zoning down, the better before worse response to many management interventions. That's a beautiful quote. I saw that and I went back and highlighted it for myself. I was like, how did I miss that one?
Yeah, I don't know if maybe it's worth just reading it because I don't have much to add to it. It's just exactly so true. And I won't name any names, but recent experience is where this takes over, then like that's where I start to lose hope. And that's not a fun place to be.
It's a good trigger on the reading it. Since you didn't volunteer, I'll throw it in. So the better before worse response to many management interventions is what makes political decision making so counterproductive. By political decision making, and that phrase buzzes to me, I mean situations where factors other than the intrinsic merits of alternative courses of action weigh in making decisions. Factors such as building one's own power base, or looking good, or pleasing the boss. In complex human systems, there are always many ways to make things look better in the short run. Only eventually does the compensating feedback come back to haunt you. And if I added extra such as's, it would be losing political capital or having egg on your face. Because boy, do I see those turn up as big influencing factors in decision making an awful lot of the time.
And there's a whole dynamic of where this connects into transformation work for us around the asymmetric risk profile of being the change agent, and people that legitimately should be and are afraid to raise their hand and try to drive some change when the cost of failure is far higher than the benefits of success for the same reasons described here.
Yeah.
Even if you're victorious and change your entire company, that doesn't happen until perhaps well after you're gone because of the bumps and scrapes and bruises you took along the way.
Yep.
So this has an upside limiter as well as a downside element.
So just before we move on, I noticed you dropped a systems diagram in here. And to be honest, when I saw the systems diagram drop in, I thought, I didn't think systems diagrams turned up till the next chapter. But it's a nice little systems diagram.
Yeah, it was like I actually got confused as to whether I was reading the 5th discipline field book or the 5th discipline. So this is one of the ones from the field book. But it's it's about the compensating feedback loops, which becomes disastrous when those unintended consequence loops are slower, and then it just kills you. But I got confused between which book I was reading.
I tell you just triggered a memory for me. Although don't be sad, because it's a really nice little diagram. I was talking to a client this week about a team that is working on a product with a lot of technical debt, and they were putting out a release that fixed 35 defects, and they went into late phase testing and found that they had introduced 55 new defects in fixing 35 defects. And this diagram so beautifully tells that story, because of course, if you take the system thinking perspective, perhaps you should be doing some refactoring rather than putting all your effort into trying to fix defects and reintroducing defects faster than you fix them, as an easy illustration of that particular systems diagram.
Unless this is the cycle of, oh, you're fixing defects, I'll bother to report these now.
No, it's not in that particular case. A sonar cube pass on it for code duplication would tell a very disturbing story. So transitioning through, and I'm going to transition through a couple of others fast to get down to 5, because that stuck out for all of us. The easy way out usually leads back in. Again, it's just such a beautiful name for the law. And I think Wolfgang's already spoken to this one quite elegantly when you think about team structures. We all find comfort applying familiar solutions to problems, sticking to what we know best. I know in the world of SAFe, it's very easy to run around going, the answer to every problem is an art. Much as in the world of Scrum, it's very easy to walk around going, the answer to every problem is a Scrum team. And that kind of trigger, as Wolfgang described at the end of the beer game, of actually going, before you go, here's the answer, seek first to understand the drivers of the current situation. But let's talk about the cure being worse than the disease, because, boy, this is a provocation. And I was interested, you guys read that differently to me. And, that quote around shifting the burdens to consultants, I must confess, I read it and I thought about them, not us. So I have an interesting wiring. So Jerry Weinberg talks about your internal unwritten rules and the importance of growing self-awareness to recognize your internal rules and how they bias your approach to situations. And I've been working on it in recent years, and boy, I'm working on it at the moment, because there's a book I'm reading that triggers it regularly. I have a unwritten rule personally about my bias towards big name brand consultancies, right? And their habit of producing very glossy PowerPoints and then running away and leaving their clients with their very glossy PowerPoints. And it's like, because as a coach, it's like, no, it's not about giving somebody a glossy PowerPoint. It's about the way you help them and make yourself redundant. And I read this quote and I thought about all the companies I've worked at where they basically rely on consultancies for everything. And the reliance on the consultancies killing their ability to grow, their ability to solve problems themselves. The bit that I've been figuring is, and much of it was triggered by the fact that, of course, Max decided he wants to be a management consultant, and all the places he's looking at are the places that I have these feelings about. But I've been trying to grow
Shall we-
more aware of the power that they have, like in terms of the things that they're really good at. You know, I'm reading this book that Michael Casey recommended in the Discord, Your Strategy Needs a Strategy. And it's written by a pair of BCG consultants and it quotes all the BCG stuff. But I'm doing an incredible amount of highlighting. And it's a real reminder to me of actually the stuff they are insanely good at. It's easy to ignore in some of your own personal biases. So I read this quote and I went, oh yeah, shift the burden to consultants. And I went, there we are. Shift the burden to your consultants who write the pretty PowerPoints. And you all went, well, that's us. And I went, that's me falling victim to one of the learning dysfunctions. What went deeper for all of you guys when you read that and thought about that as you?
I for me it was an old me, not the current me. So I didn't when my highlights over there to the right around the phenomenon of short-term improvements leading to long-term dependency is so common that it has its own name among systems thinkers. It's called shifting the burden to the intervener. And my read on this, I actually jumped to the role that the lace ends up playing in too many transformations, where once they start helping, it becomes their job to drive the change. And the expectation that that happens is actually so strong that it's hard to blame the lace, because whatever your view on consultants or lace, which are often internal consultants, they're usually people that really want to help. And it's really hard for us to say no when people ask if we can help with something. And it's easy to point at that and add all the dark consultancy patterns and the, oh, we're just gouging and taking all the money and blah, blah, blah. But often it starts with somebody saying, yeah, this is a trusted partner of mine and I really want to help them. I can help with this. And then taking it to the next click of, and now I have a team of 15 people that delivers the service ongoing on behalf of this. And now my LACE or Agile organization has 1,200 people in it, and they all just got laid off in one fell swoop in a large name brand intervention. And it's easy to watch the cycle back to the system diagram Dave dropped in there earlier that leads from, yes, I would love to help with that, to, oh my goodness, how did I accidentally build this empire I never wanted? And now I'm worried about all of my people's jobs because I'm not sure we're delivering value. Like, I can draw the path from that in retrospect.
I guess another click down, we could almost always say alongside that, consultants or helpers could almost be frameworks too, right?
Yeah.
We could be asking frameworks to take on a lot of the burden of actual thinking. So that's sometimes another problem that we might fall into.
Yeah,
Or
and when you start to talk about this stuff, I had a Fortune 50 CTO, so this guy had 9,000 odd people reporting through him. And in the middle of a class, he's like, yeah, we've pretty much outsourced our brains. And he was talking across the full spectrum, not just like consultancy outsourcing, but just acknowledging that they had lost so much in-house capability to reason about these things that I wish I had this fresh to mind, because I would have handed him this entire section.
I think there's an interesting linkage there on that one to you can have your cake and eat it too. So here's my linkage. I have come to the conclusion that a lot of what drives this is more reality than desire. Because as soon as you're coaching at senior executive level and you realize how time poor they are, and then you play the next level of perhaps their senior middle managers, good senior middle managers attract problems because everybody knows, hey, if we've got a real problem, point this person at it. And so they're really strong next layer of leadership, winds up also being drowning in work. And I think a lot of what drives the bring in a consultancy to solve the problem for me is we're all too time poor. We need somebody who is bright, and smart and has time, because I believe strongly, particularly for an executive, that the most precious currency they have is not money, it's time. And that if you really kind of probe the system of work as what drives some of this stuff, and maybe it's probably less the laces problem and more the leadership and consultancy reaction problem, is, they bring in a consultancy to do the heavy thinking for them, not because they don't want to do the heavy thinking or not because they're not capable of doing the heavy thinking, but because they're making a trade-off decision about their time. And you wonder, and I've had a few conversations on this in recent years, of whether instead of outsourcing the thinking, you can outsource some of the things that drain your time and prevent you from thinking.
I've always used the term attention rather than time, but I think we are essentially saying the same thing.
The- it- for the cure can be worse than worse than the disease. So there was one story that came to my mind, which actually happened when I was a consultant with Accenture, and it was like I was observing a lot. Like I was just there trying to figure things out through just like looking at things, trying to take my time to understand it in more depth. And then there was someone approaching me because this was years ago, and obviously it struck me that hard that it's still on my mind. It is we are not paid for observing, and it's like really, but if we can change something for like just with maybe a tiny bit of effort, if we know about it, why not investing the time into observing things? So it is also, at least not always, but sometimes from my personal experience, it's like when you're paid for a consulting work, you probably do something big that people know about it to justify your salary. And this is so strange when you read through the book. Like, of course, it is like you should talk about what you're doing, or people should know about so that they know why they pay you. But when you then read through all these like laws, then it's so strange saying, okay, how much money do we actually spend in the large companies just by people running around trying to justify the money that they get by interventions that are probably worse than if they just let the system alone?
That's beautiful. Let's move along. Quick on the way through, faster is slower. I love the quote around when growth becomes excessive, as it does in cancer, the system itself will seek to compensate by slowing down. I think it's a little bit tied to the harder you push, the harder the system pushes back. But I think for me, the instant link was back to your kind of agile transformation and trying to go too fast there. And picking your pace for things. But I just thought I thought the quote and the metaphor was beautiful.
I I took a different tweak out of it, maybe due to more recent work on complexity and such. And I read a lot of this as if you're rushing, you're not experimenting and seeing the results. So you're going to be putting the pressure at the wrong point, going into tying it into Law 8.
Interesting.
And I think that the more you, there's a exec I worked with recently. I loved working with her, and one of her favorite quotes is, "If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together."
Yeah, it's a beautiful quote, isn't it?
And this comes together with me. Like same thing. It's like if you bring people along together, you're more likely to get the many small micro experiments that allow you to go further. You can't do that going fast.
Yeah, the whole slow down to speed up. All right, jumping through, maybe just pausing on law number 8 for a second. The small changes can produce big results, but the areas of highest leverage are often the least obvious. I think the standout to me, again, is just in his storytelling and his metaphors. The metaphor he used around the trim tab on the rudder was just beautifully illustrated. And I think I particularly liked it if you think about the world of flow and picking an app metaphor, and I plan to steal this one and get good at sharing it. Because when you think about the world of flow and everything that we do in flow, picking a metaphor like the trim tab on the rudder of a ship when you're talking about flow just really stood out to me. It's like, oh, what a cool one. So let me do a protocol check. We're 25 past 8. Normally we've been running these for about an hour and a half on a close. We've got probably a couple more call outs just to have here. So we can either go, Leah, let's close the chapter. Beautiful. All right. You can have your cake and eat it too. As I said, I've been just loving this one. And I love it because you can't have your cake and eat it too is so deeply rooted in, like, everybody knows that quote, right? You got to choose one or the other. And so triggering a conversation with, you can have your cake and eat it too, instantly provides, and I've tested a couple of times over the last few weeks, it instantly turns people's brains on because you've just thrown a cognitive dissonance at them and they sit up. And the way that he brings out this, it's not either or, it's now versus later, in that metaphor of you can have your cake and eat it too. Yeah, it's just become a favorite go-to provocation for me. And you just watch people's eyes going, what? And in terms of just enabling you to step back from a situation, and quite often a very event-focused conversation into, well, let's actually think a little bit bigger picture in the trade-off decisions we're applying at the moment. I'm absolutely loving it. Anybody else? Oh, hang on. I think I've got another quote here. This is another Eric quote on the same one.
You pretty well hit it, but I do have a story on this one that's personal and fun. Is reading this, I grew up, one of our family friends was a competitive cake decorator. And so he would routinely, his name was Frank Daniels, enter cakes into the county fair and take blue ribbons and compete at the state level and so on. And once in a while, we got to eat prize-winning cakes. And it turns out they taste better after they win. Go figure.
That was a different ending to what I thought. I thought you were going to be, looks good doesn't necessarily mean tastes good. So
But the metaphor for me is sometimes things just taste better when you put the hard work into.
oh yeah,
Like it's not easy to get to the point we're talking about here of having both, but when you do, wow, does it feel good?
that's nice. I like that one. I'm going to steal that. um,
There is one thing that particularly resonated with me in that law, and when it comes to value stream mapping or value stream identification, value stream analysis. And there are a lot of people who pretend now we have to optimize the whole value stream. And this is so odd to me because, like, when you have a value stream where you have several hundred people working on that value stream, for me, it's more like balancing local optimization and global optimization. Because when you just go for the optimization of the whole value stream, then you probably lose a lot of people on the ground floor, because then they are like stuck in certain procedures that they have to do now that the whole value stream is optimized, that they will not be able to produce high quality work. Now, this is I think a really important discussion to have in the agile community and also in the safe community, saying, hey, what are we optimizing for? Is it really that we are just trying to identify value streams and then we are optimizing the whole value streams, or shouldn't it be more of a balance between local and global optimization? And how do we know whether we have a good balance?
I'm going to transition from that because I think if we open that can of worms, we just start another whole discussion. I think it's a really fun discussion, and my provocation to you, Wolfgang, is stick it on our Saturday streaming backlog.
I'll say the same thing.
That'd be a fun one. All right, let's talk about dividing an elephant in half, and then go for a close. So dividing an elephant in half doesn't produce two small elephants. I loved it. I had a number of big highlights in it. obviously it stood out to you, Wolfgang. Again, it was nice the way he referenced the tale of, the three people each blindfolded feeling at different parts of the elephant, and then he just went, let me probe another 100 feet of potential resonant insight from that same tale. I also loved it in terms of thinking about elephant carpaccio, which is one of the exercises I really enjoy running. And so, it instantly puts me in mind of very messy, sliced up elephants. Um, but it was, I thought the really interesting thing that he called out there, and it comes back to that, what are you optimizing? And the trick, I think, so often in systems thinking is, where is your system boundary, right? It's got to be big enough to be meaningful and small enough to be understandable and actionable. And experimenting with that world of going, how do I expand it enough to include what needs to be included without expanding it so far that it becomes uncomprehendable? I just thought it was a nice way of thinking about that.
And
Eric, yeah.
go ahead.
And this is where, for me, where like, how should I express that? So I feel very strongly about that. It's like when you try to divide the elephant, then oftentimes it is left to, like, when you're in hardware or software programs, it's oftentimes left to the architects. Like, you know most about the system and the internal architecture of the system. Now you have to divide the elephant. And this is so wrong from my perspective, because they are, of course, the one who have to facilitate the division of the system in the end. But most often, it's not an architectural decision how to divide an elephant. It's a decision that a lot of people have to make together. It's not only a business decision. There are a lot of other things going into such a decision. And but most often, when it comes to dividing systems, it's just something that nobody wants to get dirty hands on, and they are just leaving that to architecture. This is what I'm trying to fight whenever I can. Like, I'm trying to go against that belief system that a lot of people have.
So you're saying you shouldn't slice up an elephant alone? It's a group exercise?
Absolutely. And it has to have a lot of different perspectives.
Eric, you started on the foot?
Yeah, it's tangentially related, and sometimes it does get into the fallacy that the system is the technology instead of the human system as well. But I was thinking that it's really a perspective of the system of systems is a thing. You can decompose a system, but each of it's more like a Venn diagram inside rather than a bunch of nice, neat lines that are non-overlapping. So the same piece of the larger system might show up in 10 of your smaller systems as you also engage on the local optimizations. And I think that's the part where architect-led decomposition, it's not a software system. You don't get to just neatly say that here's the interface. Both sides of the interface are part of all the systems that call the interface. Now draw your system diagram that way, and you see where the real cognitive load and challenges come in.
So I think, and being very squarely with you on the human system side, and that was certainly what was going through my head as Wolfgang was talking. I do think, though, that we have fallen prey as the agile community has become less and less technical. I think as an industry, agility can fall prey to ignoring the technical boundaries of the system and over rotating to the human. I think, there's a world where once upon a time we over rotated to the technical. But I've seen a lot of people get into a lot of mess by going, actually, the only dimension of the system is the human dimension.
Or the governance dimension.
Yeah. So I love, as the closing quote, I loved your closing quote call out, Eric. There is no blame. And I'm going to say it's your turn to read a quote, because I think this is a beautiful one to close the discussion with.
I think the summary of this is there is no they. We all tend to blame someone else, the competitors, the press, the changing mood of the marketplace, the government for our problems. Systems thinking shows us there is no separate other, that you and the someone else are part of a single system. The cure lies in your relationship with your quote unquote enemy.
So true.
Maybe we just end on that.
Uh, I don't think, yeah. Well, I am going to do let's do a quick retro, but I think that's just such a beautiful way to end the actual discussion. I agree. Let's end on that. So, quick retro. We made it through 2 chapters. Thank you for me, an appreciation for you guys jumping and doing a bit of work in the Miro so that I could kind of see where the energy was in finding a way to move us through. And rather than trying to treat every single dot point of the book, just go, where's the energy? I know I enjoyed this week's discussion more than last week's, lots more, and I got more takeaways to kind of jog my head a little bit. Feedback from you, was it a change in the right direction? Do we feel like the balance is better?
Much better.
It's
Yeah,
yeah,
a bit
it's
of work,
different
bit of
rhythm.
homework makes it much easier.
It's a different rhythm, and I have to get used to, but it feels better. So I think it will get better next time when I'm more used to the rhythm.
You might even do some homework next time, Wolfgang.
Oh yeah.
I believe one of our community values is participation and energy.
So on that note, I'm going to take us to the outro screen and say thank you all. Fun way to start the day.